Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this month's Changing Planet seminar, titled Resetting Our Relationship with Nature, Placing COVID and Wildlife Trade Within the Bigger Picture. This seminar is hosted by the Grantham Institute and Imperial and run by myself and Ben, who are first year PhD students with the SSCPTTP. Stay up to date with our latest news, our mailing list and newsletters. You can follow us on social media, which Ben is going to put into the chat now. And currently we are also celebrating Sustainability Week at Imperial, which is celebrating the launch of our Imperial Sustainability Strategy for the next 5 years and hopefully into the future. There are events being run throughout the week, including right after the seminar, there's a event on water and waste that explores Imperial's strategy to reduce the consumption and prevent pollution. And also later on in the week, we have our own Ben giving a nature walk, showing us the nature of London that you can find in your back door. And a few other events about the ecological crisis and solutions to solve it. So with that being said, we are here for the Changing Planet seminar. And I'll introduce myself again. I'm Patrick. I'm going to be chairing this event. And there's a few housekeeping rules that we have to sort of set before we get started. So just want to let you all know that this session is being recorded and that we would like you to keep your microphones off throughout the duration of the seminar. And that if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we call on you at the end of the seminar to ask them to EJ. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, which is Professor EJ Milner-Gulland, who is Tasso Leventis Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Oxford and the Director of an Interdisciplinary Centre for Conservation Science Research Group. Her work has been wide-ranging, with a PhD focused on wildlife trade of ivory, rhino horn, and Asagi antelopes. Her current research group works on projects ranging from understanding, predicting, and influencing human behaviour, and designing, monitoring, and evaluating conservation interventions in order to improve effectiveness and facilitate socially just conservation. Run a large programme tackling the illegal trade in wildlife, EJ aims to ensure that all the research in her group is addressing issues identified by practitioners. It's carried out collaboratively with end users and builds the capacity of young conservationists, particularly in developing countries. In addition to her work at Oxford, EJ is also the founder and chair of the Asagi Antelope Conservation Alliance and chair of the UK government's Darwin Expert Committee and a trustee of WWF UK, promoting a global vision of restoring nature and conservation optimism. EJ's talk today will be focused on how COVID-19 has brought our relationship with wildlife and nature more broadly into sharp focus. In response to the crisis, there have been many calls by NGOs for stringent bans on commercial wildlife trade for consumption, but like most things, it is not so simple and there are inherent complexities. EJ will explore these, consider potential approaches to devising policies that reconcile these complexities, and finally put a wider relationship with nature and what systemic changes may be necessary for humanity on a sustainable pathway. So without further ado, I'll hand over to EJ, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks to everybody for joining, and thank you for inviting me. I feel very positively and warmly towards Imperial College because I did my PhD at Imperial lots of years ago, and then I was also a lecturer at Imperial for 15 years, including working quite closely with the Grantham Institute. So it's really, really nice to be back, and I'm really happy to be invited. So yeah, I'm going to talk about COVID and wildlife trade. So we shall start my, Okay, can you see that? Is that right? Okay, so I'm going to start by thinking about COVID-19 and the wildlife trade. And one of the things that happened pretty early on in the COVID crisis was that people started to spotlight the wildlife trade as a potential risk for pandemic disease, and particularly as a potential risk for COVID. And that led to some NGOs getting pretty excited about trying to change the way that we interact with nature. So I'm just going to unshare this and start with just a little video which will illustrate what I mean. So let me just reshare my screen. So this is a website for a coalition called Extinction Edge here, which is based on a number of different NGOs, but particularly Global Wildlife Conservation. And they have a video, which is pretty short, and I'll just show it to you.
Dear humankind, thank you for being a superhost. I never imagined I'd have the opportunity to jump to a species as abundant as you. Most viruses only get to know their original host animal. Many exist entirely in the humid understory of a remote rainforest. We viruses are kept in check by healthy environments with diverse and abundant wildlife. But when you rip forests apart and capture billions of animals to feed your insatiable appetite for flesh and false cures, you bring viruses like me out of our natural quarantines. You introduce us to new hosts, like you. A superhost of 8 billion individuals and counting. A walking, flying, swimming, human meat market. You make up 1/3 of all mammals on Earth by weight. The animals you grow to feed yourselves outweigh all the wild mammals and birds on the planet. As you drive our natural wildlife hosts to extinction, you throw us life rafts bigger than the Titanic. Why wouldn't I jump? As sinister as I may seem, it is not in my interest to wipe out my hosts. We all need other life to thrive. So if this sickness in your bodies opens your eyes to the deeper sickness in our shared planet, it will be to all our benefit. But my big question to you is this: am I enough? If apocalyptic fires aren't enough, if vanishing glaciers aren't enough, if super hurricanes aren't enough, is the cold shadow I cast across the lives of you and your loved ones enough for you to finally confront the prospect of your own extinction? Only you, humankind, can choose to be the cure to the deeper sickness. Only you can choose to nurture the ancient oceans, forests, and grasslands that nurture you, to bring back the chorus of birds and monkeys to silent rainforests, and to make wise choices every day in what you consume and how you live. By protecting nature in all its wild and wonderful forms, you protect yourselves. As the earth stops to take a collective deep breath, you have a rare opportunity to reimagine and redefine a new future. So tell me, what future do you choose?
Okay, so let me just, there we are. I suspect that most of us would probably think that much of what was said in that was fair enough, being that we're environmentalists. But if you scroll down the website, it's kind of interesting. So looking down here further, you say, make your choice. And there's an I choose to end extinction, or I choose business as usual. And the business as usual is fossil fuels and, you know, not thinking about One Health and all that kind of thing. That's great. Okay, I don't choose business as usual. So, okay, I would choose to end extinction. And then it says, here's what's to do next. And you go to step 1, and it basically says, permanently end the commercial trade and sale in markets of wild terrestrial animals for consumption worldwide. You think, okay, well, surely there's something else, because we've got to change the system. We've got to, you know, move beyond that. But no, it goes to share the graphic, use the badge, make knowledge contagious about this. So there's nothing more than really just end the wildlife trade. So I find that a bit problematic, and I'm going to kind of spend some of the next bit of this talk explaining why. So what they said is that the call to action based on that video and based on COVID is to permanently end the commercial trade and sale in markets of wild terrestrial animals for consumption worldwide. And I'm just going to kind of unpick that a little bit. I mean, to start with, it looks like a good idea. It's a simple, clear message. it's a message that can be rallied behind, because we just say, we'll end the trade in wildlife for consumption. It recognizes the link between wildlife trade and zoonotic disease. And although that link is not perhaps as strong as is always portrayed, there is a link there. It sounds like something that's feasible to do. And it's clearly not applying to subsistence users, because it says commercial trade for food. So that sounds like a good idea. But the reality, of course, and this is true with everything that we think about, is not as simple as all that. So you might ask the question of how might you actually do this? Would it actually reduce pandemic risk? And would it actually have a major conservation benefit? So we can delve into those questions just a touch. So the first thing to think about is what the wildlife trade is. And we'll start in Asia, because that's where everyone focuses when they think about pandemic disease. So the wildlife trade in Asia is a very diverse trade. So it's not just for consumption. It's also for medicine, for pets, for ornaments, various other things as well. It's also quite diverse in the locations that it takes place in. So traditional shops, modern shops, and crucially, it's also diverse in what the wildlife is that's being traded. Some of it is wild caught. Quite a lot of it is captive bred. Some of it comes from the local area, and some of it has been imported all around the world. And so when we're thinking about how do you end the commercial trade in wildlife for consumption, that is one particular terrestrial wildlife as well. That is one particular element of this very diverse trade. So how would you stop the consumption of wildlife? And the way that you would ideally do it would be to do something that's kind of fairly evidence-based and fairly rigorous. So you would think about what your intervention might be like. You do some pre-testing and piloting, and you design and implement your intervention to reduce wildlife trade, ideally in some kind of randomized trial or something like that. You'd evaluate it and then go around again. So wildlife consumption could be done in a way that is pretty, could be reduced in a way that's pretty scientific. But that's not actually how people do it nowadays. So when NGOs go in to intervene to try to reduce the consumption of wildlife, they tend to take an approach that's based more on marketing and more on large-scale mass media awareness raising than an approach that's based on targeting of particular consumers based upon evidence. So this is an example that a master's student of mine did some time ago. And what she did was she went to Vietnam, and she chose Vietnam because in Vietnam they have a large number of different kinds of wildlife consumption campaigns all happening at once. So in fact, there were 10 that were all about rhino horn, all being implemented at the same time in Vietnam. So she went to each of those 10 and she asked them, sorry, every time the screen goes to admit, I lose my thing. There we are, here we go. So she went around this kind of intervention cycle that I mentioned and said, how many of these have measurable objectives? So objectives that you could measure against. How many of them are basing their intervention on research? How many of them understand what the target audience is? How many of them are then developing messages that are based on evidence and that are based on theory? And then how many have indicators of success that you could measure against, and how many then do that measuring? So of the 10, you can see only one has measurable objectives and indicators of success. And even that one hasn't actually done the evaluation. It's got a plan for evaluation, but hasn't actually done it. And the vast majority of them do not have these kind of empirical evidence-based groundings to them. And that's a problem, because if you don't have the evidence-based grounding, you don't do the evaluation, you'll never be able to understand whether you've actually changed consumer behavior or not. So just to give you some ideas from the work that some of my students have been doing about how you might do it a bit differently, how you might get some evidence that would allow you to understand who is consuming wildlife for food and why they're doing it, so that then you could try to reduce it. This is some work that Ale, the same student, did about pangolin consumption in Vietnam. And pangolins is one of the species that was highlighted early on in COVID as a potential intermediary host. So it's one for which, you know, the consumption should definitely be targeted under this approach. So in Vietnam, pangolins are kind of consumed in 3 main forms, and only one of them is actually consumption of wildlife for food, which is the meat. The other ones are seen as medicinal, so they're not included in this idea of a ban. That is scales and pangolin wine. So because pangolin is actually illegal in Vietnam, we had to use an indirect questioning method that's meant that you randomized the questioning techniques so that people weren't actually implicating themselves when they answered it. And those yellow bars that you can see there are using this technique called the unmatched count technique, which gives an estimated prevalence of around 10% for pangolin consumption by people in Ho Chi Minh City over the last 12 months. So that's quite a lot for a species that's so endangered, across all the different types. You can see the confidence interval is very, very large, and that's because it's a probabilistic method. You can see it's sensitive as well, because the purple bars are the answer to the direct question, you know, which was, do you eat these pangolin products? And you can see a much less high prevalence when you're asking a direct question. So understanding who's eating it is the first step. To go through some of the other steps, I'm going to switch species now. I'm going to switch to Saiga horn in Singapore, basically because we're further along the publication process in this one, and so I can take you a little bit further along the intervention wheel. And also because Saigas are cool, and they're my favourite species, so I've got to have something about Saigas in here. So Saigas are critically endangered. They're found in the steppes of Central Asia. Singapore is a country in which Saiga consumption is legal because they have a stockpile of Saiga horns from before it was not allowed to be traded freely anymore under CITES. So those pictures there that you can see are pictures that we took in Singapore of Saiga horn products on sale. So there's cooling water, which is a bit like a kind of Lucasade or a Gatorade that is very, very commonly sold in corner shops, small-scale pharmacies. There's also the beautifully presented horns, and then there's horns as shavings, which you can see the one called Ling Yang. What you do is you boil it up and then you drink it for as cooling water for something called heatiness, which is basically feeling a bit fluey. So it's quite a common condition and quite a commonly used medicine, but nobody really knew how much was being used. So my student Hunter Doughty, who's just finished her PhD, did the same as Alegria in terms of finding out what proportion of people use it, and of the respondents she found, which was a pretty representative sample of Chinese Singaporean, she found that 19% of them used Saiga horn as the most frequent treatment for heatiness. So every time you have a cold or a flu symptom. The other thing that then she asked was, why do you use it? And you can see that the vast majority of people, the highest number was, it works. And interestingly, when we spoke to people about why they thought it worked, often it was because they were given it in childhood when they had a fever and their fever went down, and therefore it works. The second one is someone recommended it to me, and most of that was families. So my grandmother gave it to me, or sometimes a traditional corner shop pharmacist gave it to me. So armed with that knowledge, you can then think about how would you target your intervention. Excuse the dog. So we decided, based on the understanding that we had, that we would target the intervention to middle-aged Chinese Singaporean women. And the reason for that was based upon our focus groups and our surveys beforehand. They buy this stuff often, and particularly they buy it for others. And this thing about somebody recommended it to me and I had it in childhood means that if you get the Chinese women, then you're going to potentially have a larger impact than if you just take someone whose individual consumption is what is mostly happening. The other thing we decided based on the underlying research was to do an online intervention. This is because they look online for information. It's a very net-connected society, and these target users are heavy users of social media. When we first started our focus groups, we thought we would probably give them a health-related message, but you know, this wildlife, you don't know where the provenance is, you can't be sure that it's going to be good for you. But actually in the focus groups, the one that resonated most was a conservation message. This is a critically endangered species and you don't realise. So we went with that one. And also it was a locally focused message, and that's because Singaporeans trust their own media and their own scientists. So the message came out from our collaborators in Singaporean universities, and all the evidence from other studies shows that they care particularly about what other Singaporeans do rather than what other people elsewhere in the world do. So what Hunter did then was to use an online contagion to spread a conservation message. So just like you get social media memes, or just like you get online advertisers in Google trying to get an advert into your heads, we did the same thing, but for good. So we had a call message that Singaporean researchers have exposed tiger horn as being made from a critically endangered species. You will want to know this information as a user, and tiger horn is no longer socially endorsed by your peers in Singapore. And the way we got that message into people's brains was by the article that we published about the prevalence of tiger horn use. We got that picked up by a journalist, and it went under her own byline in the most trusted news media outlet, which is the Straits Times in Singapore. She wrote an article about the paper, and it discussed the core message because she basically used our press release. Then other people picked it up organically, and then also we had other resources available to people, so that if people went searching online, they would find other resources that backed up the message that was coming out in these seed sources. So the thing about a behavior change is that it needs to be multiply exposed and multiply shared, and people need to be able to see it a number of different times from trusted sources, and that's the only way that people change behavior. So it can't just be giving information, you have to give this kind of contagious behavior. So we disseminated it with adverts, so that then people would see it a lot, both on Facebook, Google, and something called Outbrain. These were paid adverts of the kind that Donald Trump and people like that use. So we were using it in a conservation way. Here's an example of one of the seed sources. So this isn't the Straits Times. This is another one that picked it up called The Mothership. And you can see 1 in 5 Chinese Singaporeans consume the product, critically endangered species, and it's under a byline of a staff reporter. These are the adverts that we used on Google and Facebook, and the advert was placed by the Tiger Conservation Alliance, which is an NGO that we run. And you can see this is just a little test to see whether actually the local message was important. So you can see they're both the same, except one says 1 in 5 Chinese Singaporeans and the other one doesn't. And NTU is our in-country partner, the Nanyang Technical University, who were colleagues working on this with us, but they're Singaporean university. And you can see the orange is the specific one, and the dotty one is the non-specific one. You can see the top one is click-through rate, second one is cost per click, average reach, and average frequency. And you can see the specific one had many more people clicking through on it. The next step was to monitor and evaluate. So what we did was scraping all the comments that came on Facebook underneath those adverts, and then we could see what people were saying about it. So the pink one at the top is all of the different seed sources, and then we're seeing the different people who took it up on Facebook. So Lion City News is a Chinese language, relatively traditional news outlet. The Mothership that I just showed you the picture of is a kind of youth-focused thing. Nature Society Singapore took it up. That's a conservation organization. And then the new paper is a Malaysian paper. So what you can see here is that in general, the pro message was, so agreeing with the message coming through was in the majority. The neutral and antis were more in the traditional Chinese language one. And then you can see the calls for action, not surprisingly, was mostly in the one that was promoted by the conservation organization, not surprisingly. So the other steps would be, did it change behavior? The paper's about to come out. The answer, I can tell you in the chat in more detail, was sort of a bit. And then the next thing is to learn and adapt and take it forward. So that's the kind of, we tried to, I think it's probably the first time that we've done an illegal wildlife trade or a wildlife trade consumption message that's gone all the way around this behavior change process. So that was an example, just to give you a feel for the way in which you might want to change wildlife consumption. So the potential outcomes of a ban on trade in wildlife for food in Asia. The point of what I was saying is that it will only work if society changes its mind. Laws are not enough. So the Saigers, it's legal, so the law isn't coming into question. But in Vietnam with the pangolins, we had, 10% of people in Ho Chi Minh City saying that they were eating pangolin, which is highly illegal. So laws are not enough. You have to change people's way of thinking. I do think that if you have things that are currently legally traded for food, and if a ban was effectively implemented, then those species could potentially benefit. So things like civets and bats. However, it doesn't capture the range of uses. So like with the pangolin example, there were 3 different ways in which pangolins are used. Only one of that was food. Some of the other was traditional medicine. Saiga's traditional medicine. It also at the moment is not capturing non-terrestrial species like turtles and fish. Another thing that I didn't really realize until I started looking at this under COVID was that there's a massive amount in China in particular of captive bred wildlife going into the market. And ironically, this happened because under a previous pandemic scare, which was SARS, the Chinese government decided to promote captive bred wildlife because they thought it was safer than wild sourced wildlife. And now it's a massive industry. So I think it's 14 million people are employed in this industry, and encompassing everything, not just wildlife for food. I think it's 50 billion or something like that dollars. It's a huge amount of money that's going into captive bred wildlife. So that is interesting, because I don't think we really understand the dynamics of the relationship between captive bred and wild source wildlife enough. So in some sense, captive bred wildlife might be continuing to kind of boost the trade in wildlife, but in other senses, it might also be diverting large amounts of demand that's already there, at least in the short run, into captive bred. So that's an open question, really. However, this ban could also indirectly lead to more enforcement of existing laws, and certainly there have been calls from both Vietnam and China saying we are now going to better enforce our existing laws based on COVID. So that potentially is a good thing. So I'd say that potential outcomes of a ban on trade for wildlife for food in Asia are mixed and unclear. But I think it does require changing a whole culture, which does require understanding that culture. And we've got a little way to go in understanding that culture for now. Let's move to the other major place where there's a huge amount of wild meat eaten and traded commercially, and that's in Africa. And I'll be a bit quicker on this, but it is an important component of household economies, and particularly an important source of both protein and cash for poor rural households, as well as being a major employer for many people. And actually, if you look at the pictures, although the hunters tend to be men, the people in the wildlife trade chain, the people in the markets and the traders are often women, and therefore it's actually quite important for livelihoods and for food security. So it's a really tricky thing. There's a very large commercial trade in wildlife, but it's embedded in the informal economy in a way that's really hard to unpick. It also, just as in Asia, involves a very wide range of species, and those range from things that are relatively abundant, like amphibians, to things that are much more vulnerable, so like primates, the colobus, civets, pangolins. 80% of the wild meat in commercial trade in many markets is duikers, which is antelope species which are moderately to pretty robust to hunting. And then there's also things like cane rats, like the boy's holding up, which are crop pests and are mostly trapped in order to reduce their damage on pests on agricultural crops, and then are sold as a byproduct. So one thing that people might say in response to me saying all this is that, could you not just ban the commercial trade to markets? And the complexity there is that the trade from a given hunter or a given village tends to flip between commercial and subsistence. So this is a set of hunters in a village in Equatorial Guinea, just to illustrate the point. And you can see here that in this particular snapshot, Hunter A has sold all his catch, and only hunters P and Q are not selling any of it. Everybody else is selling a bit of it. So that's within a village. But then also, from time to time, people will change. So often people will hunt for food, but then if they need to have quick cash for school fees or medical expenses or something, then they will sell some meat. So it's the interlinkages between commercial and subsistence are not straightforward. The other thing to say is that this wild meat has very different, economics depending on where you are. So this is a nice picture where you've got, this is Gabon. This is the travel time from Libreville. So 0 is in the centre of Libreville, and then 19 hours is way out in the sticks in the village. And what we've got here is a common and popular bushmeat species, porcupine, price of it per kilo, and a common and popular domestic meat, which is poultry, frozen chicken. What you can see is that the kind of elasticity of demand is very, very different in Libreville than it is in the rural villages. In Libreville, porcupine is a bit of a luxury. It's very high price. Chicken is quite cheap. Whereas in the villages, the situation reverses. And therefore, what you would do for a luxury product in an urban centre is very different to how you would intervene for a basic food in a village. And so that needs to be taken into account. One of the key things I think is really important to think about, particularly when you're starting to think about the relationship between wildlife and health, is the potential unintended consequences of a focus on wild meat consumption when you're trying to sell it as a health intervention. So this is a really nice paper about the epidemic of Ebola in Guinea in 2013 to 16. So what happened there was that public health messaging included in quite prominently don't eat bushmeat. So you can see here's a poster that was put out in Guinea by the health ministry, in which the first thing that people have to do in order to avoid getting Ebola is to stop eating wild meat. And then there are two kind of public health messages. Now this was problematic for a number of reasons. The first thing was that it contradicted people's lived experiences. So people eat bushmeat in those areas, and they have been eating bushmeat for a while and not getting sick. And so they don't recognize that eating bushmeat makes you sick. And in particular, with Ebola outbreaks, it may be that the first jump from the species into the first human is from wildlife, but basically once it's in the population, it's human to human contact that causes further spread of Ebola. It is not jumping constantly from wildlife to people. So people are correct in their lived experience that bushmeat isn't causing them to get sick. It's the touching the other people. So that message didn't resonate with people. They didn't really believe it. The second thing was that they didn't really trust conservationists. So they were living around protected areas, and they knew that conservationists didn't want them to go hunting in bushmeat in protected areas. And so they felt, okay, so these external people are coming in and telling us not to hunt bushmeat. They have a hidden agenda. They want us not to hunt bushmeat in the protected areas. That's why they're giving us this public health message. And they were probably right that there was a hidden agenda. But if people sense a hidden agenda, then it reduces trust in external authorities generally. And so what happened with this messaging was that it reduced people's willingness to collaborate with public health officials, which would then be quite a danger in terms of trying to reduce the spread of the epidemic, because if people don't trust public health officials, then they're not going to comply with them. So these unintended consequences can be pretty severe. And I think that brings us on to thinking more clearly about what the priorities are behind calls to ban wildlife markets. And obviously, you know, in the light of COVID and other outbreaks, a big priority behind banning wildlife markets is disease risk, and fair enough. But there are other priorities that are coming in, which are more or less stated in the messaging that is coming out. And one of those priorities is animal welfare, which is also a really important priority. But, you know, I think thinking about live animals in markets, people feel there's an animal welfare issue. There's also conservation. So just like the example in Guinea, you know, people don't want pangolins to go extinct. And so they would like to reduce consumption of wildlife in wildlife markets. And fair enough, that's another perfectly good priority. But then there's other priorities as well, which are less stated in these kinds of calls, which are people's livelihoods. I think if we can be a bit clearer about how these different priorities actually play out for different species, then we might end up with something a little bit better, more nuanced. So this is actually from a paper that's coming out in a couple of days' time, led by Holly Booth. And I'm just going to take you through just a few species and talk you through how, you know, stopping commercial trade in this particular species might play out against the different priorities. And so red is the cost of benefit of the trade. So red is a cost, blue is neutral or ambiguous, and green, which you'll see later, is it's final. So in the case of eating gorilla meat, it is a disease risk because it does share serious disease with humans. It's also an issue for animal welfare because they're highly intelligent species. It's also an issue for conservation. They're highly endangered. So all those things say you should not be trading gorillas. And actually stopping trading gorillas is not going to have a major livelihoods impact, because it's not really a major source of food for local people. It's not really a livelihood, it's opportunistic, it's done by commercial people. So it's not going to be an issue for local people. So in this case, one might say, yeah, we shouldn't be trading gorilla meat. And that's fine, because we're not already. So, you know, there's no new law that needs to be done. What needs to be done is there needs to be serious enforcement of existing laws in this case. So nothing new needs to be done. We just need to enforce properly. Let's think about bats. So bats are, you know, at the epicenter of a lot of disease risk, of pandemic disease risk. They're a reservoir for many zoonotic diseases, and market sales are risky. So it's definitely disease risk is something that should be uppermost in our mind. It's less of an issue for animal welfare, but, you know, they can be sold dead, they can be sold cooked. The conservation threat is ambiguous, because there are species for which it's a real issue, but there are other species for which it's less of an issue, and meat consumption is probably not the worst threat. Habitat loss is probably the worst threat for these species. Livelihoods, well, people do hunt them for food or livelihood, but they're not a majorly traded taxon, so it's not going to be something that's going to have a major impact on livelihoods. So in this case, you know, one could recommend definitely banning the trade, but you would be very, very clear that that was for public health reasons. It wasn't for the other reasons. Let's think about frogs. So frogs are one of the major captive bred species in China. So this is one in which we have no known zoonotic issues for humans. They could be kept relatively humanely. I'm not giving any judgment about whether they are at the moment, but they could be. In China, captive bred trade in frogs is a livelihood for many, many rural people, a really quite lucrative one. So there would be an issue. And then finally, for conservation, I think that's quite ambiguous, because captive bred amphibians are potentially a disease risk to wild amphibians. But on the other hand, captive bred amphibians may also be diverting wildlife trade away from wild caught amphibians, and therefore improving things. So a recommendation might be strongly regulated, only farmed trade, and be really careful about that. And it would be for conservation reasons. It wouldn't be for livelihood, disease, or animal welfare reasons. Final one, duikers, which I mentioned before. So very widely harvested in Africa, a major source of livelihoods for many people. No known zoonotic issues, but there are issues that I think need to be thought about in terms of animal welfare, in terms of snaring, and in terms of conservation, because although the harvest is apparently sustainable in some places, not in others, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So one might think about, you know, try to focus on sustainability in this case. So it doesn't really matter about what these particular species are, and it doesn't really even matter what my recommendations are. It's just, the point is really, let's try and think about it a bit more clearly and a bit more strategically, but while being clear about what our objectives are. So now I'm going to move on to a slightly broader way of thinking about things. I'm going to think about systemic changes from COVID. So what's COVID done to the wildlife trade system more broadly? This is work that was published late last year, led by James McNamara and colleagues from two Central West African countries, Ghana and Gabon, when we thought about, just in a fairly conceptual way, what COVID might have done to wildlife hunting. So we produced a model like this. So we were interested in the end in whether hunting pressure on wildlife was going to increase or decrease, potentially causing sustainability issues in the forests. And, you know, using the expert knowledge of our in-country partners and literature, we kind of conceptualized it like this, that there is a number of demand shocks that are going to happen in the system as a result of COVID. So one of them might be what I've just been talking about. So it might be that there's a heightened awareness of zoonotic disease risk, which might lead to changes in wild meat consumption, might lead to changes in preferences or regulations that would reduce wild meat consumption, both in urban and rural areas potentially. Another big one, though, is supply chain shocks. So, you know, these countries often are reliant on export of primary products that they have produced in order for their GDP, but they're also reliant on things coming in. So they're reliant on the fuel price and things like that. So if you have price shocks, that might disrupt their export markets and their import markets. Now, remember in that graph with the pink and the yellow dots, I said that there's a very, very different dynamic for urban consumption of wild meat compared to rural consumption. So I've separated them out. And in both cases, you will have demand changing depending on changes in food prices, income and unemployment, but it'll play out at the local level in different ways. So in urban case, when wild meat is a bit of a luxury, if your urban disposable income falls, then your demand might fall quite sharply as a result of that. But the other thing that happens in much of Africa is that people tend to still be quite wedded to their villages, to their rural areas. And people in urban centres, when they lose employment or when their incomes falls, there's quite a lot of migration back to the home village. And when migration comes back to the home village, that might have two results. The first one is you might get more people in the rural areas wanting food, but you might also get more hunters, because like I said, hunting is something that people do opportunistically for cash when they haven't got other things to do. And so if you have people who've got no employment in the urban centre, they might come back and resume their hunting. For the people who are already in the rural areas, then their disposable income might fall. And again, that might change their demand for meat, but it might also change their employability. So it might, again, lead to more hunting. Then the final one is global transport use declining. So oil prices falling, that might have a big impact if it's an oil exporting country, particularly. And then finally, the reduction in international travel means that we have fewer visitors coming to the countries. And that has a number of different effects. So firstly, government revenue will fall because there's fewer visitors coming to spend. And that might lead to reduction in their ability to pay for protected areas. And certainly that's been found in some places. Visitor numbers directly might also affect the ability of a protected area to operate, because it's reducing the income directly to the PA. And both of those things, so reduction in PA enforcement capacity, means that it's easier to go hunting and not get caught. So that's the conceptual model. Let's just play it through for a couple of countries. So Ghana is a country which is highly reliant on its exports of cocoa and coffee. So if it's not able to export, then that will have a major impact. And that is likely to feed through onto urban demand, particularly, leading to a dramatic fall in urban demand. We might also get some migration urban to rural. We might also get a bit of reduction in tourism. So you can see here that on balance, there's some drivers that are going to cause more hunting and some drivers that are going to cause less hunting, and it's not really clear how it will play out. Gabon is a very different country, and it's a country in which which is highly reliant on oil. And so this fall in oil prices is likely to lead to quite substantial urban-rural migration, quite substantial drops in rural disposable income, and overall probably an increase in the number of hunters, which might lead to more hunting. So those are just kind of thought models, and the next step, of course, is to actually try to get some empirical data to see how they're going. But it's a useful way to think through the broader scale impacts of COVID and how that might lead to more or less unsustainable hunting. So to summarise, calls to ban the commercial trade in wild animals for consumption are superficially really attractive. But there's a lot of underlying complexity, and I've just tried to give you a taste of that, which means that this approach is unlikely to have the desired effect. And I would have thought that a risk-based approach that explicitly expresses our underlying priorities might be more appropriate. But basically, we need more understanding of the drivers of wildlife trade, both at the individual level, so consumption and hunting, but also those systemic drivers that I've just demonstrated to you, so that we can intervene in an appropriate way. And COVID is likely to alter these drivers in complicated ways. So just for the last bit of my talk, I'm going to focus a little bit further out and focus a little bit more on the kind of global issues that we're facing now, which maybe COVID is bringing into sharp relief. And I'm sure you've all seen this before, the planetary boundaries framework, in which we as humanity are trying to live in the donut of green, where we have both, we're not exceeding our ecological ceiling, and we're also not falling short on our social priorities. So the red is when you're is the modelled evidence about the extent to which we've got a shortfall on the social foundations, so that worldwide we don't have enough peace and justice, we don't have enough political voices and so on. And the red going out is the extent to which we're exceeding our planetary boundaries. And you can see biodiversity loss is a particularly large one. How that gets expressed in terms of change in biodiversity, here's you know, a typical way in which it's expressed, which is through the Living Planet Index, which is an index of the number of individual terrestrial wild vertebrates. And in my lifetime, shocking to think that we've lost more than 2/3 of global terrestrial wild vertebrates. And that has happened through conversion of wildlife into people, but also importantly into our livestock. So you can see here 60% of mammal numbers are now livestock. It's 70% for birds. I find it more interesting really to break it down into the regional threats. And you can see here that actually the trends are quite varied region by region in the Living Planet Index, with particular steep ones in Latin America and less steep in Europe and North America. But what I find more interesting than that is looking at the pie charts, which is the causes of those declines. And there you actually get quite a lot of consistency, even though the trends differ, the actual threats are quite consistent. So about half of this change in LPI is to do with land use change, of which the majority is to do with agriculture, of which the majority is to do with livestock for meat. Then we've got about 25-ish% over exploitation, which is mostly kind of fish and timber, and then various other things, climate change coming in on the rails, but still relatively small at the moment. So this leads to quite a nice framing, which WWF has been using a lot, the triple challenge framing, which is that what we need to do is to try to have the Sustainable Development Goals met. We need to try to keep climate change below 1.5 degrees, and we need to restore nature. And the challenge then is how to make sure that we get those things all happening at the same time. Well, I haven't got time to go into how we might do that here, but I think, you know, the question then might be, what do we as researchers do? And obviously we need to provide evidence, as clear as possible, the evidence, which will enable people to focus on the key issues. And I hope I've convinced you that stopping the wildlife trade is not a key issue. It's an important issue, but it's not the key issue. We also need to engage widely as researchers to try to support that change in societal norms and give regulators, the businesses, the information and the necessity that allow them to change. And maybe we also need to engage more directly. We'll leave that to think through in a bit. I've found it very, very frustrating though in COVID and lockdown, because now is the chance to transform our relationship with nature. Now is the chance where scientists really are being heard. And just like in that video, you know, there's powerful things that we can say, but instead of being heard on these topics, there's been a lot of chat about things that are important, but not very important. And, you know, I've given this one example, but also, you know, there's been so much emphasis on trophy hunting, which gets conflated with wildlife trade, which matters a lot to some people, but not in the grand scheme of things, I would say. I'm going to be shot for saying that. And, you know, I think the voices of local people are not being as heard as they should be. So this is a rather powerful open letter from communities in Africa, just saying to celebrities, would you like to actually think about the evidence before you start making campaigns? And just to give you an idea of the stuff that's been full of Twitter, this is my colleague Amy Dickman, who's a lion biologist who spent her entire career working with lions in Tanzania, who, and this is a selection of some of the tweets about her that are not the worst by a long way. So I don't think that's a helpful way to go about things. The other thing that has been happening a lot is a lot of finger wagging. And I don't like scientists doing that either. So here's an example of this kind of thing. So setting ourselves apart from society when we're actually part of society. And so giving very scary negative messages is important, and it has to be done by us as part of society rather than warning the rest of the world from our exalted perspective. So negative messaging is helpful. You know, it leads to people getting angry, it leads to people getting scared, it leads to people protesting. But I think it's helpful in the short run. It's not the way to change things in the long run, in my view. And that is based on quite a lot of evidence that scare tactics in the end lead to people switching off. if we want to change behavior rather than just panic people, we can't use just negative messaging because people ignore it. So it leads to self-protection and inaction rather than active responses, rather than volunteering to comply. And what we need is an active response. So what we need is for everyone in society, whatever they do, whoever they are, to believe that they're conservationists, that they're part of the solution. And this is not a random selection of society. This is my family who were forced to do this. But I'm sure they really, really believe it. So that's why we started, nearly 4 years ago now, Conservation Optimism, which is not denying the fact that we're in a terrible hole. It's instead saying, yes, we do have a crisis that we need to solve, but there are ways forward. You know, people are making differences and things are and can change. Another thing that I started in lockdown as a response to some of the things that were going on in terms of COVID and not really focusing on societal change was this thing called Pledge for Our Future.Earth, which you can go and look at later if you want, which is about how to help people to have a voice about what they're going to do and what society needs to do to change. So I like this graph a lot. And this is a graph that helps me to feel positive about societal change. So what this is how quickly the number of states that are getting generally socially liberal legislation into policy. It doesn't really matter what the legislation is, but the grey line at the top is the number of states in the USA, the very thin grey line. And then the different coloured lines are different bits of legislation. And then the circle at the top is when it becomes federal law. And so no more states need to do it. So it goes state, 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 and then it becomes federal law. And what you can see in this is this kind of tipping point. So you get very little traction, almost nothing, bobbling along. And then suddenly there's a tipping point and society's ready and everything changes. So I guess the thing for conservationists is to think, you know, where are we in this curve? You know, are we still pulling along or are we at the tipping point? And I hope and believe that we're now at the tipping point. And one of the things that makes you think that maybe we are at the tipping point is that, you know, 3 years ago, there was one little girl sitting outside the Swedish Parliament, and now we've got people in South Africa, people in India, New Zealand, New York, and even where you'd think that they had other things on their mind, Afghanistan. You have school children thinking about the climate. Here's another thing that makes me think that, you know, we're on a tipping point, and this is the World Economic Forum's 2020 assessment of global risks. So on the x-axis, you've got the likelihood of a risk, and on the y-axis, we've got the impact on humanity, or sorry, on business of that risk. This was put out before COVID, I think. But what you can see here is biodiversity loss is being traced. So the top right-hand corner is the scary risks because they're high likelihood, high impact. You can see over the years, biodiversity loss is going higher and higher and higher up towards climate change. In one sense, it's a bad thing, but I actually think it's a good thing because nothing's changed that much in 3 years. But what has changed is awareness amongst the business community that biodiversity loss is a material risk. So that is a good thing. The same assessment that put that out has then assessed dependence of economic dependence on biodiversity, you know, very large estimates of dependence on biodiversity, including scary things for businessmen about coffee, which will surely make them jump with awareness. And of course, these are rough, these are underestimates. We will have more and better estimates. Das Gupta review is making a start. The Vivid Economics one also making a start. So I think we're getting towards better estimates of our dependence on biodiversity for business. The other thing that's happening, of course, is the Global Biodiversity Framework that was supposed to be in 2020 and is now going to be in October this year, where we have a Global Biodiversity Framework that could actually make a change. So I guess societally, maybe, you know, for example, with I think there's more awareness. I think there's more business awareness. There's more governmental awareness. And so maybe we are at that tipping point where things are suddenly going to start to go up. And just to finish off, I'm going to show you a few reasons why people are conservation optimists, just to cheer everyone up at the end. So because of all the people I meet who are so committed to conservation, can't see the top of the mountain if it's covered in clouds. Perseverance is the key, and I believe we're here to win the battle. The world needs me to believe, and I need to believe. Without optimism, there would be no conservation. If everyone is committed to contributing to the movement, we can truly make the world a better place. Humans don't want to live alone. I've seen the evidence we can make a difference. These two people got on the plane for the first time to come and share what works in Moroccan environmental activism. And trees make me smile. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you very much, EJ. I hope you're right that we are close to that tipping point, because well, it's very much needed at the moment. We do have a few questions for you, and the first one's from Ruben Nixon Hill. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, or I can ask it for you.
Hello. Hopefully you can hear me. I was wondering how you got funding for the ad campaign you did, and how much you think it cost, and like I was just wondering if you got any sort of pushback from the funding agencies or have difficulty getting that funding.
So the funding was from a program about changing illegal wildlife trade consumption that was internally funded by the Oxford Martin School, which is sort of like the Grantham Institute. They give out kind of large chunks of money for programs. So it was, because it was internal money, we didn't get any issues with it, and it was a PhD, and I think she spent $50,000 on it, all in all, the whole thing, which is a lot of money, but it's feasible. I think the ads cost about 30K, and you know, based on that, I would also say that the results of the behaviour change intervention were that there was some evidence of changes in attitudes and some evidence of changes in beliefs. There wasn't really much evidence of change in behaviour. And I think that's because it was a small scale campaign that ran for 3 weeks. And what you need to do with these complex contagions is follow up. So it was it kind of laid the ground. And I think if there'd been another one and then another one or another intervention, then things would have changed. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Catherine Harris.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, I just wondered, with regards, you mentioned with regards to China, how is captive bred wildlife potentially safer regarding viruses?
So you're right. You said in the chat, does it depend on the conditions? So yes, I think things that potentially might cause viruses to jump are things like multiple species crowded together in unsanitary conditions that are very stressed, because that lowers their immunity, and then, you know, you're likely to get more virus jumping. If it's unsanitary, then you might get kind of body fluids kind of swooshing about. And if it's animals that are coming from a wide different set of different areas, then of different species, then you're more likely to get a mix. So I wouldn't say that if the captive bred wildlife is in unsanitary conditions, and if the captive bred wildlife is traded alongside wild caught wildlife in the same bad conditions, then it's not going to be any safer necessarily. It also depends on the species. So certain species are more likely to, well, the evidence suggests they're more likely to have viruses that transmit to humans than others. So frogs, not a problem. Does that answer your question?
That's great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And then from Josh Lyons White.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, EJ. Thanks. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. Yeah. Thanks so much for the presentation. It's really great. I was just wondering if you think there are any lessons that we can take from your research on trying to change behaviour and reduce consumption of illegal wildlife products to actually trying to increase consumption of sustainably produced goods in some of the markets where they've historically been a bit impenetrable. So China and India are big consumers of less sustainably produced palm oil, for example.
So I think the lessons about how to go about understanding consumers are pretty transferable. So for example, that you can't do you're not going to get a lot of traction if you just do something that's very generic. You need to really understand who the consumers are and why they're consuming in order to target something that's specific to them and speaks to them. And I think that's going to be true for anything that we try to do when we're trying to change behavior. I think also the positive negative thing is interesting. So it's kind of difficult with something like don't eat wildlife, because you need to give a positive message like shift from wildlife to, you know. And so with our pangolin work that Allegri is now doing, having kind of narrowed down who the people are to target. So in her case, we decided to target people who eat pangolin as part of a wild meat menu in a wild meat restaurant, because it seems like they eat pangolin and then they also drink pangolin wine in these restaurants. So if you understand who it is that's going into those restaurants and who is taking the decision, so who's making the decision to go to the restaurant, who's making the decision about what off the menu is being eaten, and who's paying, you can understand who that is, then you can think about how they might be swayed into other ways of thinking. So we're thinking towards a celebrity-based campaign that's around why not eat domestic meat X. Obviously, you then have the unintended consequences potentially, so you have to think it through a bit further. But trying to give a positive message of don't say don't eat this, say do eat this. I could go on, but maybe that's enough.
Cool, thank you. Just a follow up from myself on that one. Do you find that a celebrity-led campaign is often reaches more people or is more persuasive and influence behaviour?
Interestingly, one of the first things that Ale did in her PhD was to do a really careful systematic review of the evidence for celebrities being a sensible way of going about things in the environment in general, and the evidence is pretty much non-existent. And in other fields as well, the evidence that we have is that you have to choose your celebrities incredibly carefully and make sure that it's not just the celebrity who gets the exposure and that the message comes through, and that it's not a perverse message. So if you have a celebrity, for example, who has no track record, then people don't take the message seriously. So if it's a celebrity who's never had anything to do with food and they start making food messages, then people aren't daft and they think, why is this person telling me about food? So in this case, part of the aim of our work for this particular one was to test the effectiveness of celebrities in this situation. So we did some really careful piloting and focus group work trying to understand who's our particular target audience related to with respect to restaurants, wild meat restaurants in particular. So very, very direct. And we got a list of celebrities and then we kind of focus groups at that list to try to understand how people might feel about celebrity X or Y. So yeah, you can't just use any old celebrity and do a mass media thing because it's not going to work.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you very much. We then have a question from Helen Burton.
Hi, yes. So it seems like there's a lot of resource being put into campaigning for bans in wildlife trade, but is anyone thinking more about regulating them? So in terms of what you were saying about unsanitary conditions, would it be worth, at least in the short term, campaigning for better hygiene regulations about separating the different species in markets and such?
Yeah, I do. But I think the problem is that it's not a compelling message. So I do think there was a bit of bandwagoning that there's the conservation and welfare NGOs who've for years wanted to ban the wildlife trade, and you know, fair enough in some ways, but I think if you say let's ban the wildlife trade, then you get a big impact. If you say let's implement strict sanitary and hygiene conditions, you're not going to get a mass movement behind that. So that's the kind of thing where you need to kind of work instead with governments. So you need that, you know, the Chinese government itself needs to think about, okay, I'm going to improve the hygiene regulations. It also then involves some costs, and it involves some kind of, you know, local authorities actually being capacitated to go and inspect markets. So those kinds of things need to be done. So what I would say is however, that simplistic message that seems to be so simple, as I tried to say, is very complicated underneath. So, you know, the trying to pressurize countries into better regulation of their markets for public health makes a lot of sense. And I think, you know, there are countries who are already thinking that way. And like I said, you know, the whole point about the captive bred market in wildlife in China was because they were trying to get it more sanitary, better regulated. So, yeah, I was going to say something else. I can't think of it now. Oh, I guess the other thing is, you know, there's nothing wrong with saying, for animal welfare reasons, I don't think we should be selling live wild animals in markets. And I actually agree with that from an animal, not from a conservation perspective, from an animal welfare perspective. I completely agree that you shouldn't be selling live wild animals in markets, except in exceptional conditions, certainly not birds and mammals. I don't see why that would be a good thing at all. But that's from an animal welfare point of view. I'd have a different set of things that I would think from a public health point of view, and a different set of things that I would think from a conservation point of view. You just have to be really clear, and then you can see where they intersect. Does that help?
Yeah, I think I raises an important point that you mentioned in your talk, is about sort of highlighting your priorities about your intervention, whether it is public health, is about animal welfare, or disease prevention. So yeah, really interesting. And then another question from Emma Burns.
Yeah, sorry, it took a second to find my mute.
No worries.
Yeah, so I agree with what you're saying. It's a lot of it is based on social change and convincing people to change their behaviours. But the graph that you showed mapping all of the dates of the social changes was based on the USA, which kind of, despite recent impressions, is one of the most progressive countries in the world. So then how are you concerned at all about the slowness of change in some other countries, you know, where homosexuality is still illegal and women still have very restrictive rights? Or do you think that environmental policies could leapfrog these issues?
That's an interesting one. They bundle a little bit, don't they? You know, so I think there's a lot of bundling of social justice with environment. So particularly when you think about Indigenous and local communities, there's a lot of consistency in what needs to be done in order to support Indigenous communities and in order to conserve nature. Not entirely, but some. I think expediency is going to help a bit. So the fact that the World Economic Forum and the UK government, through the Dasgupta Review, for example, are taking biodiversity very seriously, and that businesses are seeing it as an existential risk now, in a way they saw climate change as an existential risk 5 years ago, maybe. They're now starting to see nature as an existential risk as well. And I think that's a good thing, because it means that there will be some action. I think that grassroots social change from inside is what is required. You know, so it needs. There's no point people like me going to a country and saying, you know, you've got to sort out your environment. You've got to get, you know, you've got to start building a social movement. That social movement has to come from within. So the question then is about when you get endogenous change. So there's quite a lot of work about how much social norms need to change, what proportion of society needs to have changed its social norms in order for that to flip into a virtuous cycle of social change happening. And that's what that graph shows. So I think it was for the USA, but I think it's a fairly well-established thing that you do get this tipping point of endogenous change when suddenly a concept becomes normal. And so that tipping point is not as large, not as big as you might expect. So I think, you know, I think it varies from study to study, but, you know, you can 10–20% of society thinks in one way, then you can start to get some endogenous change going. I think that's feasible. I hope so anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and a very good question. So that's the last of our questions in the chat. I'm going to open up to the floor if there's anyone who'd like to answer a question now. And so if not, I would just like to thank EJ again for giving a fantastic seminar and answering the questions at the end. We will stay behind for a sort of a more informal discussion just briefly afterwards if you want to continue the discussions that were raised in the Q&A. Otherwise, I would like to point you towards other events in Sustainability Week that Ben posted the link to in the chat. Go check them out. There's a couple going on just now or very shortly. And then also that the next speaker for the Changing Planet seminar is David Keith, who is a geoengineer from Harvard, who's going to be looking at sort of the potential for geoengineering techniques to for climate change interventions. Yes, so thank you again, EJ, and everyone else for coming.
Thanks for coming.
Awesome.